just as a small point, on leaving office, I gave Urjit Patel a small memento, which was a reflection of what I thought was our biggest role. It was a symbol of the rupee, and below it was written, Hamari Zimmedari, or our responsibility. And I think that for the central bank, stabilizing the value of the rupee and holding it is really our most important task. And you know, I have to commend the Urjit Patel Committee report, which gave us a pathway to do that. Couple of the important things we did: move to CPI focus rather than WPI focus. CPI is what ordinary people see, the consumer price index inflation. That was a huge move and was not recognized at that time how important that was, but has over time, I think, become established as what the Reserve Bank should target. I think the big sort of change, apart from the inflation framework, was the creation of the Monetary Policy Committee, which was established after I left office. And I was always for creating a Monetary Policy Committee. I often got the question from the press, you're losing power as a governor. You can determine monetary policy yourself. Now you're letting it go to a committee. You must be against it. And the answer was absolutely not. I was totally for it because I felt that a committee would bring many minds together and result in better decisions than an individual making that decision. A committee would provide continuity. If one person left, you would still know what the committee broadly thought, and it wouldn't create the uncertainty about inflation management that would happen if you had one person and the governor left and you had a new governor and you had to try and figure out what the new governor thought about inflation. And lastly, and not unimportantly, a committee is much harder to pressure than a single person, than the governor. Of course, we've had outstanding governors in the past who have resisted any kind of pressure, but it was important to create an institutional structure which would be resistant to pressure, and that was my intent there. Let me end with a couple of issues that, you know, I made a number of speeches on the economic climate. I felt I had to go beyond just talking about monetary policy, partly because you talk enough about monetary policy, you start creating noise. People look into every statement and interpret it in different ways, and that roils the market. But as the governor of the Reserve Bank, you're the most important technocrat dealing with economic risk management. Nobody else, no other technocrat has the kind of tools you have at your command. You control 350 to 400 billion in foreign exchange reserves. You determine the interest rate policy in the economy. You're also the lender of last resort. In fact, you have the power to lend to pretty much anything if the situation warrants it. Given all this, you are effectively the risk manager to the economy. You have to warn about risk to macro stability and risk to the growth agenda. And so, in that duty, you sometimes have to speak out. In that duty, you sometimes have to say no to pressures that come down on you. You are not quite in the place of a bureaucrat. And the mistake some people make is treat the RBI governor as yet another bureaucrat. You're not, because most bureaucrats don't have the freedom to say no. They may say this is not according to the rules, but you as RBI governor have to make a judgment as to whether this is appropriate or not for the longer run benefit of the economy. There are no rules you can tie yourself to and say this is a violation of rules. It is a judgment you have to tie yourself to and say this is a violation of my judgment as the risk manager. This is going to take us in the wrong direction. And sometimes, as much as you can, you want to warn in private, but sometimes you have to warn in public because the dialogue, the broader dialogue, is going down the in the wrong direction. It also obviates the general tendency of everybody to kick the ball down the road. As the governor, you don't have the freedom to kick the ball down the road because you're held responsible for when that ball becomes large enough not to be kickable. What were you doing when it was small enough to stop? Now it's so large, it's a huge cost to the economy. Of course, not going along doesn't make you too many friends, either in government or in the interests that you're upsetting. It is important, however, that the role be understood in the right spirit. That, just because, just because government wants something doesn't mean that you always say yes. You sometimes have to say no, and it has to be recognized that you're saying no because in your professional judgment, it's not in the interest of the economy. Sometimes when government doesn't understand that your sort of duty is to say no, it creates a certain amount of misunderstanding. Lastly, let me talk about the RBI, actually second last point. RBI, I think, was a great professional organization to be associated with. And I forever say it's one of the few organizations, 80 years old, which still has tremendous integrity and tremendous capability. And people are still extremely enthusiastic and extremely capable, and we're trying to, we did a number of things to try and preserve that and improve on that. And I want to repeat one of the things I said on our 80th anniversary when the Prime Minister came to the RBI. And I said, it's a matter of great pride for me today that when someone enters our building to persuade us to change a regulation, they come armed not with money, but with arguments about what is right. And I think that still holds, that the RBI is a place where if you can persuade the officers that what you want is right, they will agree, but it's not about, it's about the best argument rather than anything else. Now, we undertook some reforms to improve the functioning of the RBI. Every organization can improve. We streamlined the structure of the RBI, changed what the deputy governors were overseeing, what the executive directors were overseeing. We increased the number of executive directors, but also changed the performance evaluation system, and I talk a lot about that. Let me end by talking about communication, which I'm in the process of doing right now. Communication is a double-edged sword, and that's why it's difficult. The press is always interested in what the RBI governor has to say, right? They give you a platform to communicate, but the press also has an obligation to be interesting to its audience. So it's always looking for aspects of what you say which are of most interest, which makes it very hard to offer nuanced messages, because nuance, balance, looking for one side or the other. Nuance doesn't work. So a nuanced message gets converted into governor slams so-and-so, or governor blasts so-and-so, as opposed to it was a nuanced message. And the place where this was most obvious is, which I talk about in the book, when I said in response to a question, India's doing so well, what do you think about it? I said, well, we're a little bit like a one-eyed man in the land of the blind. And I followed it up with saying, there's more to be done, but there's a lot that's going well. And I reproduced the full text of the response in the book so that you can see what I said. Of course, people ignored the context in which the response was there and focused on this particular phrase, the governor's downplaying this wonderful economy, and there's furor on the net. I mean, some of you, I don't read social media, but I was told that there was enormous amount of sort of traffic on that. And the problem is it becomes a game of Chinese whispers. And I don't know if you know that game. Somebody gives whispers in your ear from this side, and it gets altered at every corner until it reaches the other end when it's completely different from what you said. And sometimes you got the feeling this was what was happening. Nobody actually read the speech. Nobody actually reads the response. It is a response to what people thought the speech was about, and further on until it gets very different from what was intended. Now, truth be told, when I talked about the one-eyed man in the land of the blind, turns out that since then our growth has been slowing every quarter, right? So, in fact, we were right not to be overly complacent. wasn't that I had foresight about what was going to happen. It was just as central banker, I wanted to be cautious. I was just in Beijing last week, and the reporters there were asking me, India was doing so well. Of course, we had a certain tiff with them recently, which sort of keeps them a little antagonistic, but India was doing so well. Now, which is the fastest growing country in the world? So I think there is no return from boasting. I think it's better to be moderate and to under-promise and overachieve. In that way, we keep the world, we keep the international investor, we keep our own domestic investors appreciative of what we're doing. This notion that at every corner we have to say, we are the best and there's nobody else like us. Well, that's not true first. There's a lot of potential in India. We are capable of doing significantly more over the years to come. Let us be confident we can do it. Let us do it. But let us boast only after we've achieved it. Let us not be overly complacent before that. And let me end by saying this book is about what I actually said, not what I was reported to have said. It enables people to actually read that and perhaps see why we did what we did. And thank you very much for coming to this launch.